Hello, hello. Good evening, good evening, good evening. Can you all hear me? No, not yet. Can everybody hear me? Yes? Brilliant. Good evening and just a really warm welcome to everybody. We're delighted you're here tonight. Most of you probably know this series of events that's happening this week has been organised by a bunch of different churches in Coleraine working together. So we're not promoting any one denomination or any one church, but we're really just trying to provide a number of spaces this week where we can think together about some of the biggest questions in life, about the meaning of life and God and what it means to be human and things like that. And so if you're here tonight and you consider yourself a believer, we're really glad you're here. If you consider yourself a skeptic or a doubter or a seeker or some strange mixture of all of those things, then we're also really glad that you're here. This is not a church service, so we're not going to ask you to sing or pray with the person beside you, and we're not going to take up an offering. All that's going to happen tonight is in a few moments, I'm going to hand over to our speaker, Glen Scrivener. Glen is going to give a short talk tonight focusing on the theme of hope. And then after that, we're going to have an open Q&A. And I just want to tell you a couple of little practical things about how we'll do the Q&A. So if you've come tonight with a burning question, or you think of a burning question as we go on tonight, you need to listen to this a little bit because I'm going to explain how you ask your questions. So we have three different ways that you can ask your questions. One is we're going to have this microphone, which we're going to roam around and give to people. So you can ask a question verbally from the floor. If you're asking your question that way, we would simply ask, keep it short, so no big, long, rambling questions. And also just make sure it's a question, because sometimes when we get the mic on the floor, we're tempted to go on a little speech. So do just make it a question and make it short. The second way you can ask a question is there are little bits of paper on your tables that look like that, and there are pens there as well. And so you can write your question down. And if you're doing it that way, all I would ask is just make it readable. So if you have terrible handwriting, get a friend beside you to write it down for you so that I can read it whenever you hand them all in. And the third way that you can ask questions is the high-tech way, which Bruce is going to, oh, there it is up there. So apparently, I don't really understand these things. You can scan that QR code if you point your phone at it. You should or may be able to do that. Or you can go on the little website that is www.menti.com and put in that code that is up there, and that is you'll find our page for tonight. And you can type in your question there, so that gets around the problem of bad handwriting. The other thing you can do if you go on the website is if somebody else has put in a question, you'll be able to see it. And if you like their question, you can tick it to give it an extra vote, and it will rise up the rankings. So isn't this amazing, the things we can do? So we've got low-tech ways and high-tech ways of doing questions, and you can decide what way you want to do them. And later on, Glen and I, between us, will sort through the questions and try and deal with as many of them as possible. You may have a question relating to what Glen talks about tonight, or you may have another burning question related to the Christian faith and what Christians believe. And you're really free to fire all of those in tonight. I think that is just about all I'm going to say. After Glen speaks, we will take a short break for a few minutes, which will be a chance for you to refill your tea and coffee, if you wish, and also to write down your questions or get your questions in if you haven't had a chance to do that yet. So I hope that is okay. We're really glad you're here. We're really glad Glen is here. I'm going to let him introduce himself, But Glen, well, all I'm going to say is Glen is a speaker, an author, a podcaster, an Australian, a man with lovely hair. So people keep telling me. And that's all I'm going to say. I'm going to hand over to Glen. Give Glen a big round of applause as we invite him up.
We think, does that work? Excellent, excellent. Hello, everybody. Yes, if we haven't met before, I'm Emma's husband. I'm Ruby and JJ's dad. I'm from Australia. I live in England, and I'm here. That's all you need to know. And I'm here this week to deal with some of the biggest questions that people have in life. We're going to talk about hope. We're going to talk about meaning. We're going to talk about love. We're going to talk about humanity. And I think the reason why our churches are reaching out with these big questions is these are the big questions that people have in life. And we think that Jesus Christ has incredible answers, but it's not as though as Christians we are the ones with the answers and the rest of the world needs to come to us. It's actually that everyone in this room struggles to hope. Everyone in this room struggles with despair. Everyone in this room struggles with questions of meaning and meaninglessness. And so all of us are really coming as questioners. All of us are coming as doubters. All of us are coming as skeptics who need again to learn some wisdom. And we just happen to think that Jesus Christ has answers that everybody needs to hear. And so that's why we gather around and we have our tray bakes and we have our cups of tea. And really the main part of this evening will be John Mark and myself sitting down and just taking your questions. So all I want to do as I begin is just be provocative enough to generate enough questions that we can have a good conversation. That's all I'm attempting to do before we have a little break. I'm just going to stir the pot, okay? So if you're thinking, Glen's being unnecessarily spicy, why is he doing that? I'm just trying to provoke you, okay, to ask some questions, and then we'll get into a conversation. Does that sound okay? Now, on the slide, we're going to have a look at this ancient map of Africa. And the bottom tip, the southernmost tip of Africa, you will all know what it's called these days. I won't ask you yet. I'll ask you in a second. I'm sure you all know what the southernmost tip of Africa is called nowadays. But did you know that prior to 1500, the southernmost tip of Africa used to be called the Cape of Storms? And for good reason. All the explorers who wanted to come from Britain and the Netherlands and Spain and Portugal, they wanted to get around the southern tip of Africa because they wanted to get to what they called the Orient. And they wanted to get to India and beyond India to China. They wanted to bring back the spices of the Orient and enrich themselves and enrich all their kingdoms. Because, of course, to travel over land was incredibly costly, and there were bandits and robbers, and there was only so much you can carry back if you go on foot to India and China. What you really want to do is get there by sea. Unfortunately, you have to sail around the Cape of Storms, and those storms around the southern tip of Africa put pay to all the explorers' great hopes. All their hopes were dashed in the storms. And ship after ship after ship, explorer after explorer after explorer, experienced the storms and were dashed to pieces on the rocks. Until, on the next slide, Vasco da Gama from Portugal. He sails around the end of the 15th century, and he pioneers a path through the Cape of Storms. And where other ships had been dashed to pieces, Vasco da Gama and his sailors get through on the ship, and they get all the way around to India, and they enrich themselves with the spices of the Orient, and having navigated a path through the storms, they know how to get back again. and they bring back with them the great riches of the East. And Vasco da Gama enriches himself and his whole kingdom. And now the Cape of Storms is called, anybody know? Very good, the Cape of Good Hope. What had once been a place of death becomes a place of hope because of one pioneer who gets through the storms, who gets through the deadly trials, and is able to enrich himself and his whole kingdom. And I think about the story of Vasco da Gama every year at Easter, because we've just come through a time in which there was a great pioneer called Jesus of Nazareth. And here's the Christian story. The Christian story is Jesus set sail for the trials that put pay to all of your hopes and all of my hopes. Jesus entered into the trials of life that for us always end in death. And I'm often thinking about those explorers who first tried to pioneer a path through the Cape of Storms. They did not feel the storms at their most potent, did they? Because if you were only halfway around the Cape of Storms, and if you succumbed to the waves, then you'd only felt half the storms, hadn't you? And if you got 3/4 of the way through those storms, then you hadn't felt the full force of those storms. Only if you pass all the way through the Cape of Storms have you really felt the full brunt of those trials. And Christians believe that Jesus on Good Friday, he did not just dip a toe into death. There's great misunderstanding about what Christians believe about Easter and Jesus. I think a lot of people mock Easter and mock the death of Jesus as though it was just a really lousy weekend for the Son of God. You ever heard that? People sort of say, you know, a 3-day lousy weekend for Jesus, and then he's back in heaven and everything is peachy keen. Christians don't believe that. Christians believe that Jesus plumbed the depths of death and felt the storms of judgment more than any human being ever has or ever will. Nobody has died as deadly a death as Jesus Christ has. And because we believe it's a great love story. In all the great love stories, the hero pays a price to be with the beloved. The hero goes through a trial. He goes through many labors in order to get to the beloved. And Christians believe that we happen to be in a storm. We happen to be in a very deadly place. We happen to be the sort of people who have turned away from a God of peace and order. And here we are in disorder and chaos and storm and death. And so for Jesus to meet us where we are, he has to meet us in the midst of that storm and chaos and disorder and death. And Jesus on that cross sailed through it all. And he didn't just dip a toe in death and come back this side. Christians believe that on Good Friday, he pioneers a path through the storms of death and judgment and comes out the other side, having felt the full effects of death and curse and sin and hell. Because he's a hero. Because he's done it for love. And he comes out the other side. And at the end of the Gospels, you've got copies of Mark's Gospel, for instance, on these tables. At the end of all these accounts of Jesus' life, you get these brilliant experiences of what Jesus is like on the far side of death. On Easter Sunday, he starts appearing to his friends after he died. And it's a beautiful snapshot of what Christians believe life is like after death. If you can get through the Cape of Storms, you can get to the Spice Land. You can get to the new creation hope. And these snapshots at the end of the Gospels are just beautiful pictures of what Christian hope looks like. Have you ever read to the end of the Gospels, these biographies of Jesus? You see Jesus go on long country walks with his friends. There are barbecues on the beach, fishing with his mates. Sounds like Australia, doesn't it? It's brilliant. It's like fishing with mates, barbecues on the beach, long country walks, long talks into the evening about the stuff that really matters, a heck of a lot of meals with friends, tear-filled reunions, feasting, family, peace, grace. And Jesus, our battle-scarred brother, face to face. That's what you see at the end of these gospel accounts of Jesus of Nazareth, because this is a snapshot of Christian hope. Christian hope is that there is a way through death and out the other side into feasting joy. Do you believe it? Christians struggle to believe it. Everybody struggles to believe it, because we all know how deadly the storms are. Because we've all seen our loved ones go into those storms and not come back. We are all very aware of how hopeless life can seem. But the Bible rings out with hope, and it's the hope that one man has gotten through. It's the idea of the black shroud of death being upon the whole world. And yet, Jesus is like a needle who pierces the black shroud of death and comes out the other side. And we believe that if you're connected to Jesus by faith, he pulls you through the black shroud of death and out the other side. It's beautifully captured in probably the most famous chapter of the Bible. Right in the middle of the Bible, there are those 150 songs. They're called Psalms, the ancient hymn book of the church. And you might know the famous 23rd Psalm. Do you know that one? It's the sort of thing that's read at state occasions and funerals. And it was even read at a wedding of some friends of mine quite recently, which I think sends interesting signals about what they're expecting in marriage. Because it's the chapter of the Bible that goes, "Yea, though I walk through the valley of the shadow of death, I will fear no evil." You know, they had realistic expectations of what marriage is like. So they had Psalm 23 at their wedding. Should we have it up on the screen? Let's have a look. It begins like this: the Lord, and you can tell it's being serious, okay, because it's capital L, capital O, capital R, capital D, okay? This is the divine name of God. It's 6,800 times in the Bible. This is the maker of heaven and earth. The Lord is my shepherd. I lack nothing. He makes me lie down in green pastures. He leads me beside quiet waters. He refreshes my soul. He guides me along the right paths for his name's sake. Even though I walk through the darkest valley, in the old King James Version, "Yea, though I walk through the valley of the shadow of death, I will fear no evil, for you are with me. Your rod and your staff, they comfort me. You prepare a table before me in the presence of my enemies. You anoint my head with oil. My cup overflows. Surely your goodness and love will follow me all the days of my life, and I will dwell in the house of the Lord forever." So it's the idea that we are all walking through a dark valley, the valley of the shadow of death. And isn't that a very evocative image? It's the idea that everything you ever do is overshadowed by death. All your accomplishments, overshadowed by death. All the people you love, overshadowed by death. That icy shadow is the darkness in which we wander. And yet there is a way through the valley of the shadow of death. It's not that God beams me up out of the valley. Sometimes I wish he would just beam me up out of the valley. But it's not that. There's a way through. Because about 1,000 years after this psalm was penned, Jesus stands in front of all his followers and he says, "I am the good shepherd. The good shepherd lays down his life for the sheep." And anyone listening to Jesus, they should have been very aware of what he was saying. He's saying, I am the Lord. I'm the God, the maker of heaven and earth. I am the good shepherd. Everybody knew who the good shepherd was. The good shepherd was God. And Jesus comes and he says, yes, I'm God. And you can imagine everybody saying, what do you mean you're God? Prove it. And Jesus says, all right, watch me die. That's an odd way of proving your divinity, don't you think? I am the good shepherd, i.e., I am God. Prove it, Jesus. Oh, he says, the good shepherd lays down his life for the sheep. I will prove to you that I am the God of Psalm 23. I will prove that to you by the way that I die. Really? That's a strange way of proving that you're God, isn't it? But I guess it kind of makes sense. In the Bible, God is the source of all being. He's like a fountain of life. We have all come from the source of being, this Niagara Falls of life and love. Jesus is the source of all life. But where do you see a fountain expressed most purely? You see a fountain when it is poured out. And where do you see the godness of Jesus? You see the godness of Jesus when he is poured out with every drop of his blood. What's he doing on that cross? He's being the good shepherd, pioneering a path through the valley of the shadow of death, like a great Vasco da Gama, feeling the storms at their fullest, and expressing what God is truly like. God, as a source of life, pours himself out for you. I am the good shepherd. And the good shepherd lays down his life for the sheep. He is the one who gets through the valley of the shadow and out into feasting joy. And if you're connected to him, he carries you. That's hope. That's hope that you can cling to in the midst of the valley of the shadow. Let me just finish with one thought, and then we'll have some time for Q&A. The Bible talks about death as the last enemy. Death is the last enemy, the final enemy. And it's a bit like in computer games. Do you ever play the sort of platform computer games? You know, you get to the end of level 1 and you've collected all the gemstones or all the coins or all the rings. And at the end of level 1, what do you encounter, gamers? The final boss, right? Yeah, you get to the boss, okay? So you get to the level 1 boss, okay? And you've got to fight against the level 1 boss. And the level 1 boss is okay. You might be able to defeat the level 1 boss without losing a life, okay? But then you get to level 2, and you collect the gems or the coins or the rings or whatever it is, and you get to the level 2 boss. And the level 2 boss is like nuclear powered and has 17 arms. And okay, you probably die a few times, but don't worry, you can respawn in computer games. Not so in life, but in computer games, just go again. And you have another go at the level 2 boss. And then you get to level 3, and the level 3 boss is bigger still. And the level 4 boss, level 5, level 6, get to the level 10 boss. And he is just absolutely bulletproof, invincible, undefeatable. And the Bible says the last enemy, the big bad boss, the undefeated heavyweight champion of the world, is death. It's never lost a battle. Billions of bouts, it has never lost a battle. And yet Christians believe in one instance, death met its match. There was one person who took on death and won. We know that sounds nuts because we know what a big bad boss death really is. But we've met somebody. And we've done that thing that, you know what kids do when they debate about superheroes? They sometimes say, who'd win in a fight between Spider-Man and Iron Man or whatever, right? And you talk about, well, Iron Man's got this kind of technology, but Spider-Man has these kinds of spidey senses. And you imagine who's going to win in a fight between these two superheroes. Well, Christians kind of do that too. And we look at death, undefeated heavyweight champion of the world, the big bad boss, the last enemy. And then we look at Jesus. And on the face of it, it's the ultimate David versus Goliath. It really is, the ultimate David versus Goliath. Jesus goes out in weakness. But if you've encountered something of Jesus in these Gospels that we're putting out, if you just open up and read through Mark's Gospel, maybe you'll come to the same conclusion that I've come to. Yes, death is the big bad boss, but I think it's met its match in the person of Jesus. I think when I see his towering personality, his stooping love, I think I start to see he is the Lord. He's the good shepherd. And he's proved himself to be God in the way that he dies, in the way that he pours out his life like a fountain. And I think he is bigger than death. I think he's punched a hole through death, come out the other side. I think he's the pioneer. I think there's a way through. I think there's hope. Doesn't mean life is easy. It doesn't make the valley of the shadow any less dark. But it does mean there's a shepherd on the way through. Do you have hope? All of us are in the valley of the shadow of death. All of us. Do not do it without a shepherd. Well, that's all I've got time for. Have I stirred up enough questions? What do you think? Might there be some questions? John Mark's going to come back in a second and direct you to further tray bakes. You can talk to your neighbors about what gives you hope in a life that is full of darkness. And then after we have a little bit of a break, we'll come back and we'll answer some of your questions.
Brilliant. Thank you, Glen. So here's what we're going to do. Just take a few minutes, go and get a refill of coffee. As Glen suggested, maybe take the chance to chat to the person beside you and ask them what questions has Glen's talk stirred up in them. And take your opportunity to formulate a question that you can speak into the mic, write a question down on a bit of paper, or type a question into the high-tech thingamabobber. And we will be back very shortly. So go for it, take a few minutes. We'll be back.
Swallows up not just people and kings, but empires. It swallows up hope. And I'm telling you, Jesus was the victor over death. How can you believe that's true? How can you believe that Jesus really did rise from the dead? Just as Glen said. I often give people 3 H's because I'm a preacher who I trade in tortuous alliteration. I don't know if you know any preachers who trade in tortuous alliteration. JM? Yeah. we all do it. Okay. So 3 H's, the heavens, history, and him. Here are 3 reasons why I think you can believe in the resurrection, okay? The heavens, okay? We all already believe in a life from the dead kind of a universe. Everybody in here already believes in a life from the dead kind of a universe. Everybody already believes in 4 miracles that have already happened, okay? Everything has come from nothing. It's quite a miracle. Everything has come from nothing. Wow. I mean, I happen to believe as a Christian in the virgin birth of Jesus. But if you're not a Christian, I guess you believe in the virgin birth of the universe and without a virgin. That's some magic trick. You know, nothing up the sleeve, no magician. Just pure magic out of nowhere. Everything has come from nothing. We already live in a life from the dead universe. The second miracle is order has come from chaos. Okay? You know, if we've come purely and simply from an explosion, this is the most finely tuned and well-ordered explosion I've ever seen. When my mother told me as I was growing up that my room looked like a bomb had hit it, she was not commending me on how well-ordered my room was, okay? Explosions usually tend towards disorder, and yet we are living within an explosion. Goodness, order has somehow come from chaos. As a Christian, I happen to believe in the miracles of Jesus, like There was a time when he said, "Quiet, be still," to a storm, and he brought order out of chaos. That's quite a miracle. But I think the miracle that we all kind of believe in is that the entire universe has had a kind of a quiet, be still moment. We already live in a life from the dead kind of a universe. The third miracle is that life has come from non-life. Okay, if you're not a Christian, you have to believe that somehow all life on Earth has emerged from kind of prebiotic chemistry. All life has emerged from non-life. And if you're not a Christian, you've got to believe that that's happened without a God of resurrection to bring the life about. As a Christian, I happen to believe that Jesus walked out of the tomb on Easter Sunday. That's a miracle. I put my hand up. That's absolutely a miracle. But if you're not a Christian, you have to believe that all life emerged from non-life and without a God of resurrection. See, we already live in a life from the dead kind of a universe. And then the fourth miracle is minds have come from mindless matter. I mean, there's brain chemistry, but then there's my sense of consciousness and personhood. And that's quite extraordinary. And all sorts of philosophers of mind have noticed what a miracle it is to go simply from brains to minds. The Australian philosopher David Chalmers says, "We still don't know how you get from the water of brains to the wine of consciousness." Nobody knows how you get from the water of brains to the wine of consciousness. And of course, he's talking about that first miracle that Jesus did, turning water into wine. I happen to believe in that miracle, but all people have to believe that somehow we are left with these minds that are able to process the questions of life, the universe, and everything. So those are four miracles that already tell you live in a life from the dead kind of a world. And all four of those miracles, I would say, are orders of magnitude more improbable than Jesus rising from the dead. And when I say that Jesus rose from the dead, I'm not trying to add to the absurdity of your worldview. I'm trying to say, no, there is a God of resurrection who makes sense of all the other absurd things you already believe. I'm actually trying to explain the absurdities that you already have. I'm not trying to add to the absurdities by saying that there's a God of resurrection. So I think the heavens are already telling you that there's a kind of a God at work who is bringing life from the dead. That's the first thing. That's the first H, the heavens. And then history. Okay, so from history, we know that there was a man, Jesus of Nazareth, and he was this great preacher who was wildly popular at times and wildly unpopular at times, and he got into a dispute in the temple area of Jerusalem in around AD 30, and he was put on charge, put on trial. The Jews handed him over to the Romans executed him by crucifixion. He was definitely dead. They took down his body, they put it into a tomb. They knew which tomb they put it into. They put a guard outside the tomb. 3 days later, that tomb was empty, and Jesus' followers all had experiences of encountering the risen Jesus over the next 40 days, and then those experiences stopped when Christians say Jesus went up to heaven. Now, lots of historians will just grant you all of that. And again, when I say that Jesus actually did rise from the dead, I'm not trying to add to the absurdity of your world. I'm trying to explain what would otherwise be absurd. How do you explain all those historical facts? But it's not just the history of the first century. There's also the history of the 20 centuries since that first Easter. And the way I like to describe that is, do you know how we came up with the idea of a Big Bang? So about 100 years ago, astronomers started to recognize in the red shift that they were observing that the universe is expanding. And they thought, if the universe is expanding, then if you hit rewind all the way back to the very beginning, you'll come back to a 0 point, a point of great inflation, a Big Bang that gave rise to the inflation of the universe, okay? So that's how we came to see that there was a Big Bang, because we saw an expanding universe. Well, over the last 20 centuries, historically, what we see is the expanding universe of the Jesus movement. The Jesus movement is utterly extraordinary. I mean, historically, why have we ever heard of Jesus of Nazareth? I mean, here's a guy in his early 30s, put to death by the Romans. He was shooting his mouth off in some backwater of a long-dead empire. He was crucified, but hundreds of people were crucified. Just probably in that year, hundreds of people were crucified in the vicinity of Jesus. Why have we ever heard of Jesus of Nazareth? He was followed by losers and no-hopers, so it wasn't like he had great backers after him. He didn't have great spokespeople after him to carry on the torch. Why did the Jesus movement not die on Good Friday? And I submit to you that the reason why the Jesus movement did not simply die on Good Friday is that Jesus did not simply die on Good Friday, but he rose again, and there was an unleashing of an extraordinary spiritual power in about the year 30 AD, and the expanding civilization of the Jesus movement that now numbers 2.8 billion people around the world who call themselves Christians is testament to the fact that something was unleashed 2,000 years ago. Because the Christian Revolution is the most disruptive, it's the most influential, it's the most enduring revolution in history. How do you explain that when a guy in his early 30s is just put to death on a cross? Again, do you believe in the water into wine miracle? Here's a miracle that's even more extraordinary. How do you go from God-forsaken execution to world domination? How do you do that? Because that's a miracle that has happened. Somehow, Jesus of Nazareth has turned God-forsaken execution into world domination. That's an extraordinary miracle that has already happened. And I'm not trying to add to the absurdity of your world. I'm trying to say, I've got an explanation for something that would otherwise be absurd. The reason we're gathered here talking about Jesus of Nazareth, the reason why he really has built your world from the ground up, is because he did not rot in that Jerusalem tomb. He's alive, and he's encountering people today. And that's the third H. Not just the heavens, not just history, but him. I think the main way that people encounter the truth of the resurrection is you pick up Mark's Gospel or John or Luke or Matthew and you encounter Jesus and you ask yourself the question that the kids ask. In a fight between Jesus and death, who would win? And you're very realistic about it and you say, look, I know that death wins normally, but I think death has met its match in this person of Jesus. That's what happened to me. I was 21 years old, I was reading through Luke's gospel. I got halfway through and I just saw the towering personality of Jesus. I saw his stooping love. I thought, this is what it looks like to be God. I thought, he must be the one. And who I encountered in the scriptures was not simply a dead teacher. I was experiencing a living Lord, someone who encounters me and continues to encounter me. And I'm not alone. There are billions of us who have met a living Lord in that way. And so we've come to conclude that I guess he didn't rot in that Jerusalem tomb after all. So I would lead you to those three areas of evidence: the heavens, the history, and him.
Amazing. It appears the shorter the question you ask, the longer the answer from Glen. So bear that in mind. I have no gift for alliteration, Glen, so I have recently found myself accidentally writing 3-point sermons, so I don't know what that means. I'm becoming...
It's a slippery slope.
Becoming Presbyterian, which is no bad thing, obviously.
It was predestined, yeah.
Yeah. There are a couple of brilliant questions in here about suffering, and I think we're going to come to them in a moment, and they may be a good place to finish. But maybe we'll take a risk and see, are there any questions people want to ask from the floor? And maybe I'll just take the risk of saying as chairman, we're not going to field questions tonight about the COVID vaccine or the New World Order or Bill Gates. Those may well be really interesting questions, but I guess if you ask 1,000 Christians, you may get 1,000 answers. And we'd like to keep the focus tonight on the core good news about Jesus that all Christians have believed and agreed on together. So just to get that out of the way, we're not going to go there tonight. Sorry if that's disappointing. Does anybody want to ask a short question from the floor before we come to the final two about suffering. Mark, will I bring this down to you? No, we'll bring the microphone down. I've never heard Mark ask a short question in his life, so we'll see how this goes.
Hi, Glen.
Hey.
I just wondering, given one of the traditional attributes of God is omnibenevolence, how does that stand in relation to universalism? Should all Christians not be universalists, considering, Oregon from the start, and then something like Romans, that sort of passage, all shall be saved? How do you feel about that?
Yeah, see, that was short. See?
Oh,
See?
I was.
Yeah. Doesn't necessarily mean to be a short answer. So omnibenevolence means all loving, all good. So if God is all good, and as I said, earlier, his arms are open to you, and anyone who comes to him, he will never cast away. What does that mean for the end of all things? Does that mean the final embrace of all people, and all people find salvation in the arms of the all-good God? I think you go to somewhere like 1 Corinthians 15, and it talks about Jesus defeating the final enemy, death, and then bringing all things to the Father so that God will be all in all. And I think people like Origen really point to that. Origen was an early church theologian, and he points to that real reality that Jesus is a cosmic redemptor, bringing all things to the Father. And he plumbed such a depth that he hasn't left anything out in terms of his redemption. Now, does that mean that everyone themselves will be receiving of that universal redemption? I think Luke chapter 15 is a really interesting place to go. So it's the story of the prodigal son, and you've got an older brother and a younger brother. And everybody always in the story kind of focuses on the younger brother. He's the tearaway son who runs off and squanders the family wealth and ends up in a pigsty. And he is welcomed back by the father, because the father in this story is a picture of Christ in his redeeming love. His arms are wide open, and he redeems even that dirty, rotten son. So the sinners are utterly welcome at the feast, and the feast in Luke's gospel is always a picture of heaven. But then everyone forgets about the second half of the story, which is the older brother, and the older brother is representing the religious police of the day, the Pharisees and the teachers of the law. And he hates the mercy meal. He hates the fact that his sinner brother has been reconciled. And so he refuses to go into the feast. Now that's a very foolish thing to do, isn't it? If the feast is heaven, and if the arms of the Father are open, the older brother is portrayed as refusing to go in. So what does the father do? The father goes out to the older brother, and he says, "Don't stand on your own sense of respect and dignity. Just pull up a chair next to your brother. Just come." And the older brother finishes the story saying, "All these years I've slaved for you. How dare you?" And the father says, "No, we had to celebrate. Won't you come home? Won't you come home? Won't you come home?" And the story finishes with the older son on the outside of that feast, and the younger son, the sinner, reconciled in that feast. Now, it's kind of a cliffhanger ending. You thought EastEnders invented the cliffhanger. No, Jesus. There's another thing Jesus invented, the cliffhanger ending. Is the older son going to come in? And what we see the older son doing right at the end of that story is he's weeping and wailing. He's got angry gnashing of teeth. He's shut out from the feast. He's in outer darkness. That's every way that Jesus describes hell throughout Luke's gospel. So the sinner has found reconciliation. He's found heaven. The self-righteous one is very welcome but he refuses to be reconciled. And the curtain falls on that story with actually the religious one being outside the feast and the sinner being inside the feast. So you've got to ask yourself the question, is that older brother unreconciled because the father is not good at his reconciliation job? I think the father is very good at his reconciliation job. Is the father unwilling to reconcile that second son? No, he's very willing to reconcile that other son. But it's his own pride that kind of twists him in on himself. And though there is a universal reconciliation, though there is a universal offer, certainly within the world of Luke 15, there are examples of those who are holdouts to the love of God, who, in a sense, damn themselves and are left in the darkness on the outside, not because of the unwillingness of the Father, but because of the idiocy of sin. So that would be my answer at the moment. We can chat about that afterwards, but yeah.
Brilliant. Can I throw in a C.S. Lewis quote? So there's a C.S. Lewis famously said, in the end, there are only two kinds of people. There are those who bow the knee and say to God, "Your will be done," and those to whom God in the end says, "Your will be done." So it is a self-imposed exile.
Right.
Is that in harmony with what you're saying?
Yeah. Very much so. I mean, and what a gracious judge. He only gives you what you want. What judge gives the accused what they want? But anyone who deals with addiction sort of sees that sometimes giving people what they want turns them in on themselves. But yeah.
Brilliant. Well, I think I'm watching the clock. Our goal is to finish by 9 o'clock. So I think we're going to come to the final two questions about suffering.
Okay.
Is that okay? Just before I ask those, I'm going to let you in on a secret, which you're not to spread too widely, which is thanks to the brilliant tech team in Coleraine Baptist, these evenings are being video recorded, and those videos will be available eventually online. We haven't publicised that because we want people to actually come to the events rather than stay home. And we do want you to come back tomorrow night and bring other people with you. But I know tonight maybe you're sitting thinking, I'd like to replay that bit of what Glen said and listen to it again. And so there will be a chance to do that. Or if you're thinking, I'd really like to send that to a friend who would really appreciate it, you'll have a chance to do that as well. So you have been told a secret. Don't spread it too widely, but now you know. So let's finish with two questions about suffering. One is a short question. The other one's a little bit longer. So the short one, I'll read them both. The short one says, where is the hope for Ukraine? So thinking about, well, we've been thinking about death and about hope. How would you speak hope into that situation? And I guess at the other end of the spectrum, just a very individual, personal story about suffering, which I'll summarize, about a friend who was struggling with faith, not a regular church attender. A new minister arrived who was brilliant and really helped my friend grow in their faith, and they were enthused. But a short time later, the minister suddenly died, and my friend was heartbroken and has since questioned why God would have allowed this and asked, was this really God's plan? I'm just reading the whole thing here. Was this really God's plan for this man's life? And the church struggled as a result of that loss. And just wondering, how do we make sense of questions about God's goodness in light of a tragedy like that? So one question about large-scale tragedy in Ukraine, one about a very personal but maybe very common story of individual tragedy. How do we speak hope into those kind of circumstances?
Yeah, thank you for those questions, those who asked them. So with Ukraine, I mean, just before Jesus dies, he says to people, with the cross in view, and then sort of 40 years in the future, the destruction of Jerusalem is going to happen, and he's foretelling that. And on the far horizon, there is the end of all things that Jesus is speaking of. And with all those things, Jesus is constantly giving us a J shape. Life really is a J shape. That there is a path down and then up. And with Jesus, we can be raised up higher than we ever were before we went down. And it's the path of every great story. All the great stories, you're in the Shire, you're just a hobbit, but you go through an epic journey, and you snatch victory from the jaws of defeat, and you return to the Shire, but you're a wiser hobbit for the journey, aren't you? And you've gone on this J shape. And Tolkien is obviously a Christian deeply reflecting on the shape of the gospel. As Jesus is just before the cross, he is saying, look, the world will experience wars and rumors of wars, but that is not the end. And Jesus 2,000 years ago was telling us, this is not the end of all things, to see wars and rumors of wars. And Christians, we're the worst at this. As soon as a war happens, we're all like, I think that means it's the end. You're like, I think you'll find Jesus said, it's definitely not the end. Because when there are wars and rumors of wars, those must come. But that is not the end. And then he says in Mark 13, that when he comes on the clouds in glory, it will be like summer. Summer is coming. That through the winter of this world and out the other side, there is a greater hope. And talking to people who are in Ukraine or in Poland dealing with Ukrainian refugees, the churches have never been fuller. The prayers have never been more fervent. Faith among God's people has never been stronger. Certainly those are the stories that I'm hearing, and we tend to think, how could that be? Because we tend to think, in the comfortable West, we tend to think, oh, when life goes badly, that's the time to turn and run from God. Because God hasn't come through on his pact. Apparently, it's his job to bring comfort and ease into our lives, and when he doesn't do that, we turn from him. That's what we tend to do in the comfortable West. In the parts of the world that really suffer, suffering comes and people turn to God. Down through history, when suffering comes, people tend to turn to God. I think the reason why we turn from God in the midst of suffering is we've bought into the lie that life is really about ease and comfort and money and fame, and we tend to think life is good and God is hard. And when bad things happen, it's, life is meant to be good, isn't it? And God is hard. But around the world and down through history, most human beings have had it the other way around, and we need to learn from them. Okay? Life is hard, and God is good. It's entirely the other way around. Life is very, very hard. Life is a valley of deep, deep shadow, and wars and rumors of wars will come. And I think for the last 75 years, the post-war Europe and Australia and America, we haven't known how good we've had it. And I think in the last 2 years, we've had the return of nature in the pandemic, and we've had the return of human nature in warfare in Ukraine. And we thought that war and famine and pestilence was a thing of the past. That's just from old biblical times. And we've just been reminded, you know what, pestilence and war, and here comes famine with economic downturn, they are real. Life is hard. Life is really, really hard. It's a valley of deep, deep shadow. But when you really get that, and when you really understand there's a shepherd who will meet you in the midst of that dark shadow, then you can start to put your hand into his hand and let him lead you through it. And actually, it becomes a great boost to faith. So at the macro level, wars and rumors of wars, they will come. It's a hell of a world at times. It really is a hell of a world. We forgot that, I think, in the affluent West. I think we've forgotten that. But it's a J shape with Jesus. It is down and then up, and there is resurrection on the far side, which leads to the second question about personal tragedy. You know, as people went to the crucifixion site on Good Friday, they were going to see their Lord, Jesus, who has just said to everybody, I am the good shepherd, you know, and they must have thought, oh, brilliant, here's our good shepherd, here is hope. And then they saw him die on that cross. I mean, what a tragedy, what an utter tragedy. They didn't just see their friend die, they didn't just see their Lord die, they saw hope die on that cross. It would be a bit like if you're sinking in quicksand, and down you go, and down you go, and down you go, and a friend says, don't worry, I'm here to rescue you. They run to the edge of the quicksand, they jump into the quicksand with both feet, and they sink like a stone. And you go, oh. And let's face it, you're not just sad for your friend's demise at that point, are you? You're kind of sad for you, because he was meant to save you. And you've just seen hope die. And everybody who saw Jesus die on that day must have thought, well, that's it. There's no such thing as a J-curve. It's just all the way down into a pit. And yet, this is the pattern. It's the pattern of all the great stories. It's the pattern of all the stories that you tell about your own life. It's the pattern of wisdom. You can look back on valleys that you've gone down into that have taught you so much more. You can look back on those. And one day, the Bible says, we'll all look back on the greatest valley of all, and we'll see what good it has done. Right now, in the midst of suffering, you look at apparently random acts of tragedy, and you just think, what good could come from that? And the Bible encourages us to take a step back and trust God that one day we will look back on every tragedy like that. And with our hand in Jesus' hand, we will say, what good has come from that? You know, Jesus, there's a verse in Hebrews chapter 12, and it says, for the joy set before him, Jesus endured the cross. And it's this idea that the eternal Son of God looked at a suffering world and looked at all the suffering he would have to go through in order to redeem it and reconcile it and bring about this beautiful feast. And he thought it was worth it. He thought the feast was worth it for the valley. The feast will be worth it because of this valley. And if he made that calculation, then the feast must be worth it for whatever valley you're going through. Because his valley was a much harder valley than any of your valleys, any of my valleys. Apparently, according to the Son of God, it's worth it in the end. And you might think, well, it doesn't feel like it's worth it right now. It just feels like a dark valley. And it will. It will. The psalm before Psalm 23 is Psalm 22, where David, the great psalmist, cries out, my God, why have you forsaken me? That's what it can feel like in the middle of the dark valley. My God, why have you forsaken me? But Christians know that Jesus came as the Good Shepherd, and he took that song onto his own lips, and he felt God-forsaken anguish and agony with you and for you, which means you can pray that prayer too, and you can know that even in God-forsakenness, God the Son is with you. That's a mind-twisting truth, isn't it? In God-forsakenness, God the Son is with you. Because God has experienced God-forsakenness. And I know in my life, the times of deepest intimacy and closeness with Jesus have come when I'm at the deepest part of the valley. And there'll be many Christians in this room who will understand that. And if you don't understand that and you can't wrap your head around it, find a Christian who has gone through a deep valley and ask them about it. And you will hear stories of the J-curve. You will hear stories of Jesus meeting me in the midst of the hardest times. Sometimes it takes years to figure out what God was up to. Maybe we won't understand in our lifetime. But because of Jesus' J-curve, Christians believe that God will redeem our suffering too and make sense of it all. One day we'll look back and we won't just say, what good could come of that? We will say, what good has come of that?
Can I just, on all of your behalf, just say a huge thank you to Glen for fielding those very tough questions with grace and wisdom and even alliteration. I wonder, do you want to give Glen a round of applause just to express thanks? And just to say, if you don't need to rush away now that we're finished. You can hang around and chat. If you still have questions you'd like to talk about, you could talk to the people around you, the person who brought you tonight. You can come and talk to Glen, who'll be hanging around up here. You can come and talk to me or some of the other church leaders who are around. Kind of aware, we finished on the theme of life being hard and suffering and the valleys people walk through. And if tonight maybe you're not really wanting to talk anymore, but maybe if you're finding life really hard and you're feeling really hopeless, and you'd really like someone to pray with you, then again, just to remind you, head for that corner down the bottom, and there'll be people there who would love to pray with you if you're in a really dark place, or just would love someone to pray for what's going on in your life right now. And the other thing to say is, please come back tomorrow night. Same time, same place. Bring a friend. The tray bakes will keep flowing. And Glen will be speaking on the topic of looking for meaning in life. We'd love to see you there. So thank you for coming.